Located in Angus, Scotland, Glamis Castle is arguably one of the most haunted castles in Europe. Royal connections at Glamis stretch back to 1372, when the Thane of Glamis married the daughter of King Robert II. It was the childhood home of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, and the birthplace of Princess Margaret, sister of the late Queen Elizabeth II. Despite its beauty and striking appearance, Glamis Castle has an extremely dark and violent past, with family tragedies, scandals, secrets, and murder. Within the castle are many rooms that have been bricked up and forgotten over time. For this reason, nobody is quite sure how many rooms are in the castle to this very day. A room referred to as the Haunted Chamber, its site within the castle known only to a select few, was the location of a mass murder during the violent times of clan warfare. One evening in 1486, a large number of the Ogilvie clan, fleeing from violent clashes with the Lindsay clan, knocked on the door of Glamis, begging for refuge within the walls of the castle. The Earl allowed them inside, explained he'd hide them safely, and took them to a room deep within the sprawling castle, with the promise of food and refreshment to follow. With little sympathy for their feud, he swiftly locked the door, bolted it, leaving them to starve to death. Inexplicable noises and piercing screams are a feature of this mysterious castle, and in 1875, Dr. Frederick George carried out research into the hauntings at Glamis. A correspondent wrote how decades earlier, the head of the family with several companions, who were not acquainted with the haunted reputation of the castle, decided to investigate. He wrote, "One night, when the disturbances were greater and more violent than usual, his lordship went to the haunted room, opened the door with a key, and dropped back in a dead swoon into the arms of his companions, nor could he ever be induced to open his lips on the subject ever after. It is said he beheld an unventilated room full of human remains and skeletons, some who seemed to have died in the act of eating their own flesh from their arms. Fearful of what he had discovered, the Earl had the room bricked up, leaving the bodies in place. Today, the room is no longer sealed, the remains have been cleared, and it stands as a bare, whitewashed chamber, with a heavy sense of unease. Violent cries, screams and thunderous knocking are still heard in this part of the castle at night, but solid apparitions are not seen. It's hard to imagine the Ogilvies, imprisoned and left to die, would have met their fate quietly. The Grey Lady is the most frequently observed ghost at Glamis. She haunts the vicinity of the private ornate family chapel, dedicated to St. Michael, just off the Great Hall. This peaceful, elegant and tragic figure seems to have good reason to return to Glamis. The Grey Lady is thought to be Janet Douglas, Lady Glamis, widow of John, the 6th Lord of Glamis. King James V, who was crowned a king at just 17 months, loathed the Douglas clan, as Janet's brother, Archibald Douglas, had become the king's dominating stepfather when he was only an infant. King James grew to hate the Douglas clan and carried out a ruthless vendetta to cleanse Scotland of the Douglas name, seizing their wealth and land. Janet Douglas became the focus of the king's hatred, and without the protection of her husband, she and her son John became easy targets. Glamis Castle was seized by the king, where he held court for 5 years, stripping the castle of its valuables, leaving little for John to inherit. Janet Douglas was convicted of plotting to poison King James V and assisting and corresponding with her brothers, who were conspiring against the king. After a lengthy imprisonment, and despite the false allegations, on the 17th of July 1537, Janet Douglas, Lady Glamis, was brought from the dark dungeons at Edinburgh Castle and burned at the stake at Castle Hill, with great commiseration of the people, being in the prime of her years, of a singular beauty, and suffering all, though a woman, with manlike courage. Her 16-year-old son, who endured torture, was found guilty of concealing his mother's plot and was sentenced to death, but after the king died, he was eventually released. In 1543, he was restored to his titles, estates, and ancestral home of Glamis Castle, becoming John Lyon, the 7th Lord Glamis. After Lady Glamis's execution, the Grey Lady began to appear at Glamis Castle. The Queen Mother's sister, the Dowager Lady Granville, spent many hours in the chapel playing music. On one occasion, she felt she was not alone, and was convinced that she was being watched. She turned to see a lady wearing a distinct grey dress, kneeling in one of the pews, her head bowed, fingers clasped at prayer. She appeared initially as a solid apparition, and Lady Granville was struck by how neat her appearance was. The dress was carefully stitched, a perfect fit, and included large, somewhat unusual, elegant buttons, and she wore a ring on her left hand. As the sun shone in through the window of the chapel, the figure became less solid, as the light went through her, the window pattern emerging on the floor. Lady Granville wasn't scared of the apparition, and returned to her music. As she finished playing quietly, the Grey Lady vanished. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, also witnessed this apparition, praying in the exact same spot. Timothy, the 16th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, also saw the same Grey Lady after he had visited the chapel to look at some paintings located there. He also saw the apparition in the same pew as his aunt and left the chapel, not wanting to disturb her. Janet Douglas was well respected and admired in her lifetime. The events leading up to her tragic and untimely death shocked many. Does she return to the peace and quiet of her beloved Glamis Castle to relive happier times in her life, or to pray for the forgiveness of those who conspired against her? We may never know. The apparition of an unknown, tall man wearing a long dark coat fastened at the neck has been seen travelling through a particular locked bedroom door, halfway up the winding central stone staircase. The daughter of Lord Castleton, visiting Glamis many years ago, awoke and was astonished to see the figure of a large elderly man with a beard seated in front of the fireplace in her room. She watched closely as he turned his head to look at her. His face was that of a dead man, sallow, expressionless, and terrifying. He then faded away, and calm was restored. Dr. Nicholson, the Dean of Brechin, staying in the same room, witnessed the same phantom, but on this occasion he stood at the foot of the bed, his dead face staring directly at him, before disappearing through a wall. The same figure was encountered the following night by the Bishop of Brechin, Dr. Forbes, a renowned skeptic, who subsequently offered to carry out an exorcism. However, this did not take place. Other visitors sleeping in the same room have awoken to the sounds of a sword fight occurring on the staircase. The sounds of clashing sabres, quick and heavy footsteps of people in pursuit have been heard, and the sounds of bodies momentarily crashing into the wooden doors have been witnessed by guests. Of all the ghosts at Glamis, the hauntings of Earl Beardie are possibly the most terrifying. Many guests staying overnight, especially with small children, have experienced his disturbing antics and fled the castle in terror. Located high up in the tower, one of the oldest areas of the castle, is a room with 2 doors, a trapdoor and a small window. It is here where Earl Beardie was said to have gambled with the devil. There are several versions of the story. Earl Beardie was actually the 4th Earl of Crawford from many centuries ago, and he quarrelled with Lord Glamis as they gambled. Beardie, a giant-sized obsessive gambler, was thrown down a stone staircase, but he did not die. The Sabbath was quickly approaching, but Beardie was desperate to continue drinking and playing. He returned angrily, stamping his feet, demanding if no man would play cards with him, he'd play with the devil himself until doomsday. At that moment, a man in a dark cloak appeared, some say through the trapdoor, and the gambling commenced. The stranger proposed higher stakes, which the Earl accepted. Whoever lost would sign a bond for whatever the stranger required if he couldn't honour the debt financially. Swearing, shouting and cursing echoed through the castle. Beardie died shortly afterwards, and the man in black simply vanished. The sounds of a card game are still heard, with the accompanying outbursts, disagreements and curses coming from Earl Beardie's room. Dragging furniture, heavy footsteps and violent crashes disturb staff and residents alike. The sounds even resonate on a Sunday, the Sabbath, a day where gambling was forbidden. The devil had redeemed his bond. The soul of Earl Beardie is now trapped to play their gambling games forever. Several rooms experience paranormal activity attributed to Earl Beardie. In November 1869, a lively dance was held in the newly refurbished dining room, and the party continued until the early hours. 3 visiting families, relatives of Lord and Lady Strathmore, occupied 3 rooms on the clock tower landing. Mr. and Mrs. Munro, visiting with their young son, were staying in the Red Room, and their son slept in the adjoining dressing room, which had a heavy and awkwardly stiff door. Mrs. Munro woke suddenly to feel the sensation of a long beard brushing over her face, as though someone was bent forward, looking at her whilst she slept. There were no candles lit at the time, and from the limited moonlight, she could see a heavy, tall figure walking through to where her little boy slept. She shouted for her husband to wake up and light the lamp, but at once they heard their son shriek in terror. The frightened boy exclaimed he'd seen a giant. The parents tried to settle the infant in their room, when from elsewhere in the castle they heard a sudden crash, as though a heavy item of furniture had been overturned. At that moment, the clock struck 4 a.m. At breakfast, the following morning, one of the other visiting families declared they'd had a terrible night, with candles being extinguished for no apparent reason, and their little dog howling in terror as though being provoked by a stranger during the night. They too heard the crashing furniture at 4 a.m. Lady Granville, elder sister of the Queen Mother, explained that it was not uncommon for children sleeping in the upper rooms of Glamis to wake up screaming that a huge bearded man had leaned over them, brushed their faces and stared at them. The disturbances became so bad that for a time the rooms were emptied of furniture and guests were accommodated elsewhere in the castle. The following is one of Glamis's best-known stories. At the time it was a scandal and a secret that was never talked about by the family at Glamis. The Queen Mother's sister said, "Our parents forbade us ever to discuss the matter or ask any questions about it. My father and grandfather refused absolutely to discuss it." In December 1820, Lord Glamis, the 11th Earl of Strathmore, and Charlotte Grimstead married. Records show in the Peerage of Scotland that they had a son who was born and died on the same day, October the 21st, 1821. rumours quickly began to circulate that the baby had not in fact died, but had been brought up in Glamis, hidden away due to his physical appearance. It seems that when the baby was born, he had some sort of physical illness, but was in good health nonetheless. The midwife who delivered him was shocked to see that his death was recorded on the same day, and some believe she may have started the rumour in local villages. It seems the story developed and became more and more exaggerated, embroiled in Victorian melodrama, and the story of the alleged monster spread to mainland Europe. Sadly, with perhaps old-fashioned attitudes towards physical disability at the time, it was decided the son could never inherit the castle or the title of Earl of Strathmore. It was expected that the child would only live for several days at most, but the child did indeed survive, outliving his father and younger brother. This became a closely guarded secret and was only declared to successive heirs when they inherited the title. One family friend, an admiral who visited the castle, believed the son lived until 1921. One of the earliest surviving descriptions dates from 1908. It states, "In the castle of Glamis is a secret chamber, in which is confined a monster, who is the rightful heir to the title and property, but who is so unpresentable that it is necessary to keep him out of sight." It is thought that the last heir to inherit this family secret was the 14th Earl, who became 21 in 1876. His son once declared, "I feel sure there is a corpse or a coffin bricked up in the castle walls somewhere, but there are so many, one could search forever." In the 1860s, some structural alterations occurred at Glamis. One workman inadvertently drove his crowbar through the wall and discovered a hidden cavity. He clambered inside and discovered it was a corridor with a solid locked door at the end. He could hear mysterious sounds from within, but realising he shouldn't be there, he returned to his fellow workmen and explained what had happened. News of this incident got back to the Earl, who was in London at the time. He swiftly returned to Glamis, presented the workman with a considerable sum of money, and induced him to emigrate to Australia with his family. He was never heard from again. Today, the story of the monster lives on. High up on the roof of the castle is an area still known as Mad Earl's Walk. Legend suggests this is where the man attempted to escape, or where he was able to exercise. Is the figure of a man, nicknamed Jack the Runner, seen racing across the park on dark nights, that of the unfortunate Earl trying to escape captivity from Glamis?